Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Dev Ed Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about becoming a technical speaker. So we're excited because we have a really great guest with us on the show today. We're going to give her a minute here in just a second to introduce herself. But first, let's go around and say hi to our regular panelists. So today we have Luis Hernandez.
Hola.
We have Mike Dane.
Hey, everyone.
And Sam Julien.
Hey.
All right, cool. And then, so today we have Aspen Payton with us, and we're pretty excited. She gave an awesome talk at the ng-conf. So we think she'll be, great to talk about becoming a technical speaker, but let's give her a minute to introduce herself and kind of tell us a little bit more about her journey through web development.
Hi, thanks for the great introduction. I've been in the industry for over 20 years now, so I have quite a bit of time under my belt. I started out studying technology at UAA, which is the University of Alaska at Anchorage. Most of my career, though, was with IBM in Rochester, Minnesota. I moved there shortly after I graduated, mostly low in the development stack. I started out working on mid-range performance tools, moved into predictive analytics on the mainframe, and then ended up working on Watson for clinical trials matching. I also spent a lot of time working on inventing during my time there. I have over 32 applications or granted patents submitted to the US Patent Office, and I worked a lot with the IBM process for approving inventions. They would call them invention review boards. But after spending many years there, I decided I kind of needed a change. So about 18 months ago, I got an offer to work as a UI developer at the Mayo Clinic, also in Rochester. So I ended up joining them in the Research Application Solutions unit. It was really kind of my head first jump into UI development, and it's been a really rewarding experience. I've enjoyed it a lot. I've been working on a tool called Registry Assist. Basically, this is a tool that helps researchers collect and augment data for their studies. And we were writing this in Angular 5 and with some Java APIs and then SQL in the back end, a database. More recently, I was working through certification for the electronic health record that Mayo uses called Epic. And then in the last couple of months, I took a lead role within my unit. So I'm kind of transitioning again, learning more about our management side of our business.
So you really haven't done very much then. That was a pretty awesome list of things under your belt, but you can add to that a technical speaker. And like I said, it was, at ng-conf, it was really great to hear you. And so everybody go check out her stuff. Cool. Well, let's kind of get into this. So, the Dev Ed podcast is all about education. We really want to talk not just about web development and programming, but really get to the heart of the learning aspect to it. So when we start talking about being a technical speaker, that on the surface kind of looks like it has nothing to do with learning and education. But when you really stop and think about it, it really is, because, and we've gone over this in one of our episodes in the past, where one of the best ways to actually learn is to teach. And I think that's what this is right here. When you have to write and prepare and give presentations as a technical speaker, you become a learner because you have to be knowledgeable enough about something to actually go and teach it. So let's kind of just start off, Aspen, and let's actually talk about why you applied for ng-conf and kind of your journey through that whole process, from deciding that you even wanted to do that to then preparation, coming up with the topic, going through the CFP, all of those steps. And then also, was it beneficial? Did you feel like at the end, were you happy that you did it? Is it something you would do again? But just kind of walk us through that whole process.
Okay, that was a lot of questions. So I made a couple notes, and if I missed something, stop me.
We'll get to it.
So about a year ago now, last summer, a coworker of mine mentioned a smaller conference called Midwest JS that's held up in Minneapolis. And taking even a further step back, I had done conferences before when I was at IBM, and then I was away for it for many years. So when my coworker mentioned this conference that was local, I thought, hey, why don't we throw something out there? And it turned out that the day he mentioned it was the last day of the call for papers. So we really quickly wrote up a little abstract and threw it out there to see if it would get accepted, and it got picked up. So we went up last summer, like I mentioned, it was in August, and did a short presentation talking about how we were using NGRX within the application we were working on at Mayo, just to kind of give people a very practical view of how one might implement this technology and how it could benefit them. So after that, when I was at that conference, I heard people talking about ng-conf, and I thought, well, that sounds really cool. It's a much bigger group of people to get exposed to. And, you just learn so much from conferences in general, making some networking connections, going to sessions and learning new topics that you might not know about. So I was kind of waiting to see when the call for papers would open for ng-conf, because I had in my back pocket an idea for a workshop. And it was something that came up when I was trying to explain NGRX to my own team. I kind of just stumbled upon a good example that was kind of technology agnostic. It wasn't specific to, the medical field or financial or something like that. So I took the idea and then I built an application around it, and then I used that to teach my team. But by the time I had pitched it to my team, it was too late for the Midwest JS conference. So I thought maybe I could just throw it over the wall at ng-conf and see what happened. Given that it's a much larger conference, I had no idea what my chances were of getting selected, but I was happy to find out that I did. And then, of course, I got terrified because then I found out how many people attend ng-conf and that I was going to have a way bigger audience than I did at Midwest JS. So they hooked us up with another speaker during the whole presentation development process. So I got all of my slides together. Previously, I didn't even have slides. I had built this application, but I didn't really have a solid process and presentation to go along with it. I kind of just did it on the fly. So I put this slide deck together to go along with it, and then did this slide exchange with one of the other speakers who was extraordinarily helpful. He has talked a lot and gave me some good feedback on, I just had a few lines of code that weren't quite using current standards. So he gave me some ideas on how I could, spruce it up a little bit to be more current, which was super useful. And then in addition to that, ng-conf gave us the opportunity to work with a speaker coach, Valerie Cattell. And I met with her at least twice, and I found her so helpful because even though I've done conferences in the past, I'd never had formal coaching. And she really gave me some things to think about that I hadn't considered before, particularly with setting expectations with the audience. And I think that really helped me let them know what to expect from me so that we started out on the same page. Let's see, am I happy that I did it? Absolutely. It was a fantastic experience. I was a little worried going in that my workshop was going to be too basic because there's so many speakers that are just experts in the field, and I'm somebody using the technology. I'm not one of the people creating Angular. So I kind of, there's always a little bit of worry that maybe you don't measure up to the people that you consider experts. But I told people when I started my workshop that the thing I am an expert in is what worked for me in learning this technology. And so that's what I was there to share with the audience. And I would do it again, absolutely, because I think ever since my workshop ended, I've been my wheels have been spinning on what I might talk about next time.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. Okay, so you kind of talked about some things that I'd like to pinpoint a little bit and open up to the rest of the panel as well, so we can get everybody's thoughts on this. But like Louise and Sam and Mike, why bother? Why, going to a conference in and of itself is a really great experience, and it can open a lot of new doors and opportunities. But why bother actually speaking and becoming a technical speaker at one of these events?
Well, there are many, many reasons, but I would say that the teaching and learning part has been the best for me. I mean, obviously speaking is good for your career in a lot of ways, but I really enjoy the teaching side of it. And I find that anytime I try to explain something to somebody else, I learn it a lot more solidly because I start thinking about the questions or objections I would get on the topic. And when I'm trying to explain them to somebody else, I realize how many things there are that are like, oh, I just do this because some other person told me to do it a long time ago and I forgot why. And so when I'm preparing a talk, much like writing an article or doing a screencast, you start to think about somebody being like, well, why do you make the Webpack config like this? And you're like, I don't know. And so you go and you read the docs and figure it out. And that's been a really great experience for me. I've really learned a ton through giving technical talks. It's been really awesome for me.
Yeah, for me personally, as a developer, like one of the things I always love is hearing how other people learned something. So I think Aspen was talking a little bit about this, how, she's an expert at how she learned it. And to me, that's the point of giving a conference talk, which is just telling people how you learned something or how you relate to some technology or how you're using something. Like, because we have all these abstract frameworks and technologies and programming languages, but they're just tools. And so when you can see how other people are using those tools or how people are learning to use those tools, I think that's really helpful. So anytime I'm teaching or talking or watching a talk, that's always what I'm looking for, is like any sort of insight as far as how someone was able to use the tool or to learn how to use the tool. So I think that's a good motivation in itself, because it just helps the community. It helps people use these tools better.
Also want to plus 1,000 on Valerie as a speaking coach. Like, getting to work with her was an immense privilege and totally leveled me up as a speaker. If you ever have the chance to get some speaking coaching, it's funny, I've noticed a few conferences have started doing that, and the number of people who take advantage of it seems shockingly little. And it really, really helped me a ton. Valerie pointed out things that I just never would have even thought about with my like stage presence and my intonation and all kinds of things, even how to walk up on stage. So if you ever have that opportunity, it's well worth it.
Okay, so that brings up an interesting question then, I think, because, I kind of feel like ng-conf sets a really high standard. This is an ultimate conference with excellent, people like organizers who really have it down, and they're always looking for ways to improve, but that isn't every conference. So if you don't have a coach like Valerie, how would you practice? What suggestions or tips can you guys offer for preparing yourself to actually get up on stage or get in front of the classroom and give that presentation?
Yeah, I think a couple things I could mention is, when I was working with Valerie, she gave me some links to other people's material. So I think that going out and watching even just some of the ng-conf presentations, some of the previous ones, to see just how people are approaching a topic, how their slides look, just their general presence might give you some ideas for yourself. How to practice. For me, I hate sitting in a room talking to myself. I mean, I do it to an extent, but I need to be in front of actual people. So I actually had a coworker who moved to another area recently, and I recruited him to bring together a small group that I could use as guinea pigs. So I went next to the building next door, and I actually did my entire presentation for a smaller group of people. And it was so helpful because it helped me figure out, I thought that the way I was going to flip between my StackBlitz code and my slides was going to work one way, and it didn't work at all when I got up in front of this small group. So having that at least one practical dry run through it so you can figure out where the kinks are is invaluable.
Yeah. For ng-conf, I went totally ham on practicing more than I had practiced any other talk in all of time and space because of the number of people. And I would practice it. I pretty much wrote it out and just made like basic slides, which is a pro tip. Don't ever make your slides right at the beginning because you're going to change them so much. Don't do any styling till the end because you're going to waste a lot of time. So I made very basic slides and practiced the flow of the talk every single day. I would film myself practicing the talk and adjusting from there. And then I set time to give the talk at a local meetup. I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks out from ng-conf so that I could do the practice and see how it flowed in front of other people. And by then I had to finalize most of the slides. And so that also gave me incentive to have the talk done before the actual conference. And I'm going to link an article. There's a really great article by Gary Bernhardt called How to Prepare a Talk that is sort of the Bible that I've used for my talks. You know, everybody prepares talks differently, but this seems to work really well for me, of like hammering out the topic and the outline and the code and making very, very basic slides, and then waiting till the end to actually do all the styling once the flow of the talk is done. That's my process.
Hey, Sam, can you remind me, how long was your talk at ng-conf?
My talk at ng-conf was 5 minutes.
Okay.
And it was actually the most difficult talk I've ever given because it was only 5 minutes, and you have like no extra time to waste anything or to ramble. So I had to script every single word and practice every single word in a way that I've not had to do for any of the like 20, 25, 30-minute talks that I've ever given. So it was extremely labor intensive, but it also really leveled me up as a speaker to have to be that concise and like perfect a talk in 5 minutes. It was crazy.
Yeah, I asked just because I think that the length can really affect how you prepare, because I thought about doing the meetup thing, but with a 2-hour workshop, it's hard to get people to dedicate that much time.
Yeah, that's true. 2 hours is quite a chunk. You'd have to really do some prep ahead of time to get people to come to that.
One format I've always found that's just a good place to, teach or just to practice something is like just in your office. I know a lot of offices and companies that I've worked at do like lunch and learns. So, maybe on Fridays, like someone will just give like a 30-minute or an hour talk on something. And it doesn't have to be professional because it's just with people you work with. But I've been in situations where people have been preparing for talks and they just, kind of rough draft it out in 30 minutes at lunch, or they do it for other teams that aren't their team, while they're eating lunch. So I think that's a good way to practice something just with people in your office, because it's less pressure and you're out there representing that company. So they're more likely to be honest with you as well.
Those are great ideas though. Just putting yourself in front of an actual audience and, going through the motions. I think sometimes it's easy to kind of underestimate what teachers go through and just how difficult it really is to get up in front of a group of people. Even if it is in a classroom with only 30 people or 25, there's still the process of, like once you have actual people in front of you and you're interacting and engaging with them, it changes everything. It's one thing to get up and present something where there's no interruptions, but then when you bring in people who can actually interact with you or, like ask questions and things, I think it brings in a whole different element. But, practicing for all situations, I think is always a good idea. So, Sam, you kind of mentioned one thing too that I think is an interesting topic here, and that was the slides and going through the process of creating the slides for yourself. And you'd mentioned, not really making them until after the presentation. But will you guys kind of walk through that as well? So Aspen, what was the process for you? Do you have any suggestions, any tips on making the slides? And then Louise and Mike, if you guys want to jump in as well.
Sure. I think I mentioned early on, I came up with the idea and this, like the actual application that I was going to be creating during the workshop first. And then I kind of went back and, broke down step by step, this is the chunk of code we're going to work on first, and then we're going to do this next step. And one of the pointers I got from Valerie that was super helpful was creating checkpoints along the way. So since we were live coding and I was using Stack Blitz, I kind of broke it up into phases first so I could create checkpoint repositories. So if anybody got lost, then when we hit a checkpoint, they could catch back up by jumping to the next repository. And then that was the basis for my slides. So then I took, that format, and then I created the slides to go with it. And I agree with Sam. I think I did the styling like really last minute. Worked with text the whole time I was doing my dry runs and stuff. And then at the last minute, I went and, made them look pretty. Oh, and one other thing, don't be wordy. That's my other suggestion for slides. When you put up a slide and it has like everything you're going to say on it, people get lost and they don't pay attention. They're too busy reading your slides to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. The biggest thing for me is always like, I might write out a small outline of where I assume the talk is going to go, but doing the code first is the best way to do it, because the way you think you might explain something is really different often than the way you would write the code for it. Like you might think it's logical to, explain routing after authentication or something like that when you're just thinking of it in your head. And then when you go to write the code, you're like, that doesn't make any sense at all. I would never code it this way. And so then that will heavily influence how you write the talk. So I tend to just get some basic idea of what I want to say in an outline, and then immediately go to writing the sample code and hammering that out and making notes along the way of what I'm doing and how I'm going to explain this, and maybe potential pitfalls or things like that. And then I work really hard I'll probably make like some black and white slides that just have like 1 or 2 words to start getting like signposts of what I want to say. And then I'll start practicing the talk and like adjusting the flow of the slides as I go. And that way the talk is largely done before I add any styling or images or animations, because you can do all of that stuff. Like you can perfect the look of the slides all the way till the end. But once you do the styling, it's really hard to undo it. So that seems to be the best process for me. And when I first started speaking, I was terrible at slides. I used slides.com for a long time. They looked ugly. I didn't have any way of sharing them. Then I moved to Google Slides, and then I finally moved to Keynote and started getting good at Keynote through like advice from other speakers and stuff. But I think for a lot of new speakers, it's really intimidating. They see people who are experienced with these like immaculate Keynote presentations, and they're like, oh my God, I could never do that. Like, don't stress about that. That's actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is your content and the way you present. And then you'll eventually iterate on making slides and like figuring out your code samples and things like that. So like, don't look at somebody who's got 10 or 20 years of speaking experience, or even 5 years, get you down from just getting out there and getting started,
I do think that's a good point, because when I got paired up with Manfred to do my speaker review thing, I looked at his slides and I thought, oh my gosh, I really need to step up my slide game.
Yeah, I just did a talk with Mike Ryan, ng-Vikings, and that was the first like pair talk that I had done. And I learned so much about talk preparation and slides and stuff like that from Mike, because he had done a bazillion NGRX talks in the last couple of years. That's another great point, is like if you can pair up with somebody and get some feedback ahead of time, you'll learn a lot just from that. I don't know why, but people don't tend to write down these things. Like I'm actually going to work on an article about this kind of thing, because for some reason there's a lot of like articles on applying for conferences or like things like that, but there's all these unspoken things that speakers do that nobody talks about, and I think we should start telling more people that.
One thing I will say about slides anytime I watch talks is I don't like when there's too much information on a slide, specifically if there's like a huge block of code. I find a lot of times the talks that I really like are the talks that are able to highlight the information that's necessary, and then they can kind of, remove all the stuff, all the kind of clutter code or all the other stuff that we don't really need. And I think part of that's just knowing your audience, like knowing, okay, this audience probably understands all of this stuff. They probably understand this stuff. So I don't need to include that. Whereas this is the thing that they're really here for. And that's what I'm going to highlight on the slides. So I think being able to balance that where, you're only highlighting the information that's really important, and you're not just, berating the person with information that's not useful to them. That's one thing that I've always liked, is a well-balanced talk that has the right information on the right slides.
See, I agree with that. I would say that the slides really should just be more of a supplementation to the actual talk and presentation itself. They should just be, I picture them more as like, here's what we're going to cover in this talk, or even as a summary at the end, and maybe a little bit in between. But for me, the most powerful talks are the ones that are actually showing the code. And I don't think the code should always, or I think it should really be limited to how much is in the slides. If you're going to be showing code, it should be done more live. But yeah, to me, the slides are just more of an addition to the rest of the presentation. I think the real learning comes from demonstrating and the actual presentation.
My colleague, Kim Maida, is probably the best slide creator I know. And so if you want to see an amazing example of balance in slides and how to present code and stuff, her ng-conf talk we can link to about state management in RxJS, like her slides are just a whole different level. And she does a great job because what she does is instead of throwing up a big chunk of code, she zooms in on 1 or 2 lines and then walks through it using the slide animations. And it's really incredible.
She's pretty great. We like Kim. All right, now here's a question I probably should have started with, but that's okay. How do you pick a topic? There's a lot of different things you could choose. So how do you actually narrow in on what is it that I want to actually give a presentation on?
I think there's a couple of ways you can go about it. I mean, for my ng-conf presentation, it was more that I had stumbled upon something, learning it on my own. So I learned it first, and then I thought, oh, this might be useful for other people. But I think you can also go about it the opposite direction. If there's something you want to learn, building a presentation on it is a great way to go about it.
I am really glad you mentioned that, because a lot of people make the assumption that to give a presentation, you already have to be an expert on something, but it so isn't true. I think what's most important is having the passion to want to know it, whether you already do and you're still passionate about it, or like you said, Aspen, whether you are curious about it and have that drive enough to then go learn it so that you can teach it.
Yeah, that was another secret that I didn't realize when I was starting to give talks. I thought that in order to come up with a good conference proposal, I had to know the subject really well and like basically know enough to write the talk on the spot. And I learned that like a lot of people don't do that. In fact, probably the majority, I mean, unless you're a true like subject matter expert on something like Mike on NGRX, like most speakers out there don't do that. They actually pick something they want to learn about. Like they might learn enough to write a good abstract about it to submit to the conference, but they come up with something that sounds interesting, some new way of tackling something, and submit the proposal, and then use that as a way to learn. And that like never occurred to me. And so next year, that's probably what I'm going to do, because it's really stressful trying to think like you really get in your own head thinking like, well, I don't really know, like I'm not as good as so-and-so on this topic, or I don't really know what to say about that. Like if you kind of just put that out of your head and just think about what's fun and exciting to you and what makes you want to learn, that's probably a good topic.
I think that goes a lot along with just development in general though, right? I mean, we aren't all geniuses at this. Like there's always something new to learn. There's always more room to grow. And I think that it goes so much along with the realities of just being a programmer in general, and just getting over that imposter syndrome, you know, that like we're always learning, we're always growing. So just don't be afraid to push yourself to just go and learn something. But again, don't feel like you have to be an expert in it today to apply to give a talk on that topic. So then once you've picked your topic, we've talked about this a little bit, but is there anything else you can add on actually preparing for a talk beyond just getting up and, you know, presenting in front of a group of familiar people? But what other ways can you prepare to give your talk?
I guess in addition to getting up in front of people, there is quite a bit of work on your own that you have to put into it to make sure that your timing is down. You know, if you're given a certain amount of time, and I mean, I had 2 hours to work with, but I didn't want to jump into it and then go too fast and end up, you know, a half hour before I was done. And I also didn't want to go over. So there was still a number of times that I was going through it on my own and rewriting the code and rewriting the code over again to make sure that I had the timing down exactly right. And part of that repetition also just gets you more comfortable with the material, because the more comfortable you are with what you're going to talk about, the less freaked out you're going to be when you get in front of a big group of people.
Yeah, for me, I would say getting to the code as fast as possible has been the best thing I've picked up, because I kind of have a tendency, and I'm sure other people do, of like watching a bunch of other talks on a subject, or trying to like read a bunch of articles on a subject, or like making slides or something like that, basically doing everything but the actual work of making the talk. And I found that the fastest way to actually do something useful to prepare for a talk is to make a GitHub repo and pull up the docs and just to start doing it and fail at it as fast as possible so that you can start getting good at it. And yeah, that's probably my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, and when we say code, since we're talking about technical talks in general, it's any kind of demo that you have to do, because sometimes it may be about networking. So maybe you have to pull up some servers and do some configuration files, maybe on the GUI. So any kind of demo, jump to that real quick. I think a good strategy also is to find someone that understands technology, possibly another developer, but of a different technology. So this is going to be their first exposure to this. This is going back to what Julien said before of finding the whys. Some things that may be evident to you may get the audience of your talk caught up on, I don't understand, I don't have the context for this, so I don't get it. And you may lose them right there just because they lack the context. Let's say that you're doing a talk on Angular, finding someone that does maybe C# or some other unrelated technology, and kind of, if you can, run the talk against them, is going to give you those, help you identify those little things that might trip off your audience.
I think those are great suggestions. Another thing I would add to that is, and maybe not so much for, those 5-minute talks that you were saying that you gave, Sam, but for the longer ones, that's a lot of time, and you never quite know how the presentation is going to go. And so I always think it's smart to have a plan B. If something doesn't quite go right, what happens if the internet is down? What happens if, there's a technical problem? Something goes wrong. What do you do? I just think it's smart to kind of plan out, okay, if this happens, this is what I do. So I think just kind of having a quick backup plan is a smart idea.
And a joke. If you want some ideas, go watch Scott Hanselman. He's a master of distraction when something is not going well.
There you go. I love it. Bring in the humor.
I wanted to just reinforce one thing that Luis just said about context, because I do think, and I think he meant like the 5-minute thing, not so much, but I think when you're doing a longer talk, a lot of times I think people look at it and go, well, yeah, that seems great and new and shiny, but how does it relate to me and what I'm doing? So if you can give them some solid examples of how it would be useful to them, I think that can be really helpful in drawing them in and connecting with you early on.
Great thought. Really good thought. All right. So one big question I have is, and I think this is something that probably most people deal with, not all, but it's stage fright. You're up in front of dozens, if not hundreds of people. So not only how do you prepare for that, but what do you do when you're actually there in the moment? How do you confront this issue of stage fright?
If I can jump in, I'm going to go back to my past for just a moment. The first time I got up in front of a big group of people was when I was working at IBM, and we have meetings with what we call our large user group. So it's small group of people, but they're big customers. So it's important for us to make good impressions and communicate well with them. And so it was the first time that I was presenting information about what my team worked on to this group of people. And I was so nervous. I've never been one to necessarily enjoy public speaking up to that point. So I got up and I communicated the information. I think my biggest fear was that somebody was going to ask me a question I couldn't answer at the time. But I got through it. I got the information communicated, and the people came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, I couldn't tell you were nervous at all." And so at that point, I realized that I could fake it till I make it with public speaking. If I just got up and did it enough, maybe I would actually become comfortable with it eventually. And another thing I realized quickly is that it doesn't matter if somebody asks you a question you can't answer off the top of your head. You can say, "Oh, that's a really great question, and I'd be happy to connect with you after this talk to get you answers on that." So there are ways to get past these things that people find so terrifying. The biggest thing is just getting out there, putting yourself out there to share information with your community.
Yeah, and people need to remember that the audience is empathetic with you, because most everybody is afraid of public speaking to some degree. And so when they see that a speaker is nervous or like makes a mistake or something, the vast majority of people will instantly feel connected to you. They'll feel like you're relatable. They'll empathize with you. They'll support you. They'll cheer you on. I mean, it's very, very rare that if you make a mistake or you're nervous or something, that some like idiot is going to be a jerk to you about it. It's super, super rare because people really respond to authenticity and being relatable. And so the nervousness is understandable, but you just have to remember that 9 times out of 10, maybe 9.9 times out of 10, the audience is on your side and they want to see you succeed.
I love that. I think, and it's so true because there is that relatability to just being human and making mistakes. Like we're all imperfect. We all do it. So it's not that we want to see the presenter actually make a mistake, but it just is, it makes them more human, like you were saying. And I think it just makes you cheer for them a little bit even stronger. So, but okay, now if that's the case, how do you know when you actually aren't doing a good job? How do you know it's just not going so well? And what do you do to correct it if it isn't?
That's a really hard question. And I'm going to jump in, but I don't think I'm going to have a complete answer on this. I feel like I think I'm not doing a good job if I feel that I'm not making that connection with the audience. My biggest strategy is try to get ahead of that before I ever get in the room. And I think that the experiences I've had where I feel like I don't relate to the audience are when I spend my time talking at them and just telling them things. The more I can make it interactive with them, I think the better success that I have had personally.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of a matter of trying to get a sense of whether the audience is paying attention, whether they're engaged, whether they're just like mindlessly scrolling on their phones. And you just sort of have to adapt. I mean, sometimes there's not much you can do about it. You just have to roll with it and be better next time. But sometimes you can mid-course adjustments where you vary your speaking level or something. Like a lot of times people will tune out if you start getting monotonous and robotic, and they just sort of like, it just becomes background noise. And so if you notice that people have tuned out, try, lowering your volume, raising your volume, moving around on stage, like doing something to regain their attention. And then if that problem is actually a structural problem in your talk, like that you've gone, sometimes people go way down the rabbit hole on something that like is just way too technical for like a 30-minute talk. And so you can use that as feedback for next time where there's, you went way too far off on like the event loop in JavaScript when your talk is actually on RxJS operators, then you know that you've lost people at that point and you need to simplify that the next time you give it.
Yeah.
And on that learning from that kind of experience and trying to adapt for the next time. The one other thing I would add is if you have a point where you're making a transition to a new slide or a slightly different topic, if you can try to draw them in with a question for them to try to get a trigger on them about how they might be interested in this, then that might be a way to kind of pull them back around with you.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to that. You have to get out of your slides. You have to get out of your computer, because what happens is I've seen talks that just they get on their computer and it's like they're talking to themselves and they continue going. Julien mentioned moving around on the stage. I'd say make pauses. You have to make pauses so that you can go and read the audience. Normally what happens is if you might be too nervous, so what you're doing is just trying to get it over with. But no, don't do that. Go to your slides and at some point make a stop and go and read the audience, like look at them, see where they are. And if you feel like you're losing them and you're going to have those cues, and it's becoming harder because of the technology now. Like before, there were not so many distractions on their phone. Not everybody had a laptop, they were using, or a tablet. So now it's a little harder because you're competing with those devices, but you can still see the people. Someone is, tweeting the conference talk and cheering you up on Twitter, but they're also paying attention. So stop and read the audience. And if you see you're losing them, asking the question. That was also what I think that helps a little bit. Like stop, ask 4 questions. Like, we have a question. Do you have a question about this? Like, make it a little specific. That normally is going to give you an idea of if everybody's lost or they're just, maybe they're mesmerized by you. But if they don't have any questions, or you ask a question that will give like a yes, no, or raise your hand or this or that, like raise your hand if you think it's this, or raise your hand if you think it's this other thing. Those questions that are easy to answer, that you just get them engaged a little bit, that may reel some of them back into your talk.
Luis probably has a lot of experience with his students being mesmerized by him, huh?
No, I teach in an online setting to 200 plus students, so it's a little harder to keep them engaged, mainly because you can't really read them. You can't read the body language. You can't see whether they're looking at you or not. You don't know if you move quickly to a slide and come back quickly to see if anybody's like noticed that you did that. So yeah, it's a little harder for me.
That's a whole other ball game though, right there. Just the fact, teaching or giving presentations in person, live, versus in like an online webinar or workshop, that it's two totally different games. But I really liked what everybody said. The only other thing that was coming to my mind was, sometimes I've seen presenters who get up and I think they try to be, I think they've seen other presentations from other people that they really liked. Oftentimes they tend to be funnier, a lot of humor. And I think that they like how someone else did that and brought in that humor. And so they try to bring it in themselves. But maybe they're not necessarily a naturally just like off the top funny person. And so what ends up happening is that they put out this personality and energy that isn't true to who they are. And I think that sometimes that can become a problem. But I think just sticking to your own personality and knowing that people will love and enjoy you for who you are and they'll appreciate what you have to present. But just sticking to your own personality and not trying to mimic what other people have done that was successful for them. Just do what works for you. So then our last question, I think Aspen, you were kind of talking about this a little bit, but how do you enjoy this process? How do you go through it all? I mean, it's a lot of preparation, a lot of work. There's a lot of nerves involved in it. How do you go through it and actually make this an enjoyable experience?
It definitely has its ups and downs. There are moments where you might be in the middle of it thinking, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? And you just plow forward and get the material done. I think I mentioned earlier, going through the iterations of presenting to actual people, talking to speaker coaches, you slowly start to get more comfortable with it and more confident that you're in a good place and that's going to go well. And then the day will come and you'll probably be really nervous, but you work through the nerves. I always enjoy it more when I feel like I'm having a conversation with the audience and we're kind of in it together. So that's the way I kind of look at it. It makes me less nervous when I'm up on stage. But really, for me, the most rewarding part is after I finish and I can talk to the people that were in the audience and I get comments like, I didn't understand this before I went to your talk and now I understand it. And that makes it all worthwhile for me, is that I was able to help people understand a complicated topic.
Yeah, agreed.
Awesome. Louise, any last thoughts? Okay. I think, I've never given a technical presentation before, but certainly as a teacher, I think one of the things that I always had to remember was connecting with my students. And I think it would be the same way with presentations. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think just making it about this love of, what you're teaching and presenting, this common relationship between you and your students or the people in the audience on having this shared appreciation for programming, whatever the topic is on, but remembering to keep it about them as well and not just, being the only person in the room who has the knowledge on this topic, and don't pretend to be the only expert, but remembering that we're here together as a community and it's something we can share and love as a group. And to me, that makes it more fun when you can actually connect with people and kind of build a community and a relationship with these other people rather than just kind of being the sage on the stage and doing it all by yourself. So that's kind of my last thought on that. All right. So that was the topic. Do we have any last thoughts? Anything else anybody wants to say, just kind of to wrap it up here?
I would just like to throw out there that if you've ever had the inclination to go give a talk but have been nervous about it, or if you just have a method that's worked for you, something that helped make a complicated topic click in your mind, that's the start of a presentation talk that can help give you back to the community as a whole.
Awesome. Yeah. And then also just how much it can change your career as well. You know, it can really open a lot of new doors and new opportunities for you by connecting with new people in ways that I think you don't even expect sometimes. You never know who you're going to meet when you go through this process. So I would just say, even if you're happy with your career, but possibly just looking for a little bit of a change, definitely give this a consideration and push yourself to do something that scares you, because usually it's the things that scare you that end up being the most worthwhile. So, okay, well, as is tradition, we need to go through and share our favorite thing of the week. So Aspen, I kind of told you before we started, but for anybody that doesn't know, we always like to end the show by sharing a favorite thing. You know, that could be a favorite movie that you've seen recently, a new app that you're using, any kind of product, or just anything, whatever it is that you are just super into at the moment. What is it that you would share with your best friends if they didn't already know about it? So Aspen, do you have something in mind?
I do. I am going to preface this by saying I'm an NPR junkie, so I am constantly listening to podcasts that they put out. And my most recent discovery is a podcast called Throughline. And it basically takes current events and then digs into the history behind them to kind of explain how we got where we are today. And I've been binge listening to it lately. It's been really interesting.
Louise, do you have anything?
Yes. Teach Like a Champion is a book, but there's also a website, teachlikeachampion.com, that supports it. But the book has a set of techniques that you can start implementing. Some of them are more geared toward classroom settings, but we have found useful ones that we can apply even in an online setting. Pretty good stuff. So Teach Like a Champion.
And Sam, what about you?
So mine is an old game that I only recently started playing. It's a game called Transistor by a company called Supergiant. And I've had friends tell me about this game for years. It's the same company that made a game called Bastion, which is also a really awesome game. But it was on sale on Steam for $5 this week, and so I finally bought it. And it's really cool. It's like action RPG with just like beautiful graphics and an amazing soundtrack and this like interesting narrative style. So if you're looking for a new game, this is a really good one, Transistor. And it's cheap right now.
Awesome. Okay. Well, if anybody has listened to the cast in the past, I'm rhyming, you know that I like reading books. And I also love Star Wars. So Joe was really nice and got me a new book recently called Alphabet Squadron. And I haven't finished it yet, but for as far as I am into it, it's really great. So if you're into Star Wars and you want something that's maybe not the classic, Luke Skywalker or, Princess Leia, but something a little bit different, kind of on the outside of those storylines, definitely give Alphabet Squadron a look. So it's worth your time. But cool. Okay, well, that is the episode for today. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. And we'll just see everybody next week. And I know by the time everybody listens to this, the game will be over. But in 3 minutes from now, the USA will be playing England in the Women's World Cup. So go USA. But other than that, we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.